Shalom, friends. Rabbi Steve Wiseman of Temple Solel and Bowie back with you again for another video in our series of Judaism Unplugged videos. This one entitled, Time is on My Side. In this video, we will build on our understanding of natural time and the secular calendar and move specifically into looking at how the Jewish calendar evolves, building on its overarching philosophy that time moves whenever possible from darkness toward light, just as we move in our lives from lower levels of success and status to greater glory, hopefully. But also how the calendar begins to impact Jewish life, how we begin to form holidays, why some of them fall where they are. This will also be a more philosophical discussion than just a basic learning about which dates on the calendar correspond to what celebrations and demarcations. But with this as background, when you look at a Jewish calendar, it is our hope that you will understand even more fully how that calendar works and why the things that are on it are where they are and behave the way that they do. So, having already set out that Judaism has a basic philosophy for organizing time, that our days begin at night in the dark and move toward the light of daylight, that our months begin with the new moon phase, the darkest of the phases, and work toward the light and then ebb. And likewise, that the year, at least for the sake of counting the year itself, begins in the fall at the end of the growing season in the ancient world, as we work through the growing darkness towards the winter solstice, and then the rest of the darkness of the winter season, and back towards the light of the growing season and spring and summer, and eventually the life-giving harvest right before the fall begins. So there's an approach, there's a philosophy behind Jewish time. There's also a need on the Jewish calendar in ancient times to account for both the sun and the moon in our telling of time as a Jewish culture. Like most ancient peoples, months were significant to us because they were manageable lengths of time, 29 and a half days. So they were generally seen as being about 30 days. 30 became a number of some significance. There's even a school of thought that the reason that there are so many places in the biblical text where things are referred to as happening in 40s, the 40 days and nights of the flood of Noah, the 40 years wandering in the wilderness under the leadership of Moses after we left Egypt before we came to the Promised Land, the 40-year reigns of both King David and King Solomon. That when we see things referred to as 40s, and I would throw into that one as well the 400 years roughly that our ancestors spent in servitude in Egypt. When you see things referred to in 40s, it may not actually have been a quantitative number. 40 may have been adjectivally a heck of a lot of, because it was enough more than the countability of a 30-day month of days that when you get to 40, it starts to get hard to keep track. And so a flood that lasted for 40 days and 40 nights was interminable. 40 years wandering went on forever, as did the memories of a servitude in Egypt. And for the newly born nation, having both its second and third kings of the unified kingdom reign for 40 years would be an indication that they reigned for a very long time each, long enough to sort of blot out any memories of Saul who came before them, long enough to dominate what would come after them. So with the month as the basic counting element, you count the days to make up a month, and then you count months to make up a year. That would be a basic lunar calendar. If you look at the Muslim world still today, because the Muslim world was born in the nomadic world of the Arab Middle East of its time, there was not a strong connection to the land agriculturally. The Islamic calendar is a purely lunar calendar. If you live by the Islamic calendar or you have friends who are Muslim, you will have noted that every year their monthly fast of Ramadan comes about 11 days earlier on the secular calendar than it did the year before, as do their Eids, their feast days, and their other observances on the calendar. They are all constantly moving 11 days earlier each year. And the reason for that is because a lunar year of 12 lunar months, where a lunar cycle is about 29 and a half days, comes out to 354 days. A solar year based upon the path of the Earth around the sun, we know now is 365 and about a quarter days. So there's a difference of 11 and a quarter days between a purely lunar calendar and a purely solar calendar each year. Hence the movement of the Islamic holidays through a secular calendar. On the Islamic calendar, they fall on the same day in the same month every year because those months are lunar months and those days within the month are consistent. It's only on our secular calendar that the holidays appear to move and the observances appear to move. Likewise with Judaism, but Judaism's motion is a little bit more complicated because once we settled in the Promised Land, we became agricultural. We were dependent upon the growing seasons that are solar based. And so the Jewish calendar, amongst its uniquenesses, is based upon both the sun and the moon. The simplest way to say this is that, like the Islamic calendar, left to its own devices, our ancestors would have counted 12 months and begun a new year. But after 2 or 3 months, there would have been a significant enough shift in where the observance days were, and one in particular, as we'll see in this video, that there was a need to adjust. And the simplest adjustment in that world between solar and lunar would have been to add another whole month. So that every couple of years there would be a 13-month year that would push back where the holidays fell the next day and allow the moving forward to begin again for another couple of years. And in fact, if you do the math, if there's roughly an 11 and a quarter day difference between a lunar cycle and a solar cycle, it turns out that over the course of 19 years, you're going to be off by about 213, 214, maybe 215 days just on the pure cycles, which is about 7 30-day months or 210 days. And the other minor distinction over the course of 19 years of 4 or 5 days total gets worked out in some other adjustments that have to be made to the calendar to account for Jewish needs specifically, and we'll see those as well. So within every 19-year cycle on the Jewish calendar, there will be 7 leap years. a leap year adding a 30-day month, unlike our secular leap year that adds a single day at the end of February every 4 years. So Jewish leap years happen a little bit more often, 2 or 3 years between them. And it's a whole month, not just a day. But in terms of how that functions on the calendar itself, it actually works exactly the way adding a day to February does. If you remember your Latin roots. If instead of looking at the secular calendar as starting in January, as we've been taught, you see it as starting in March to make it more consistent with ancient timekeeping, and to get the names of the months of September and October, November, and December to line up with the meanings of their Latin roots. The leap year day on the secular calendar gets added to February, which when you count the year that way would be the 12th month. For the Jewish calendar, that added month is called Adar 2 or Adar Sheni in Hebrew, because the last month in the cycle of months on the Jewish calendar is Adar in a normal year. So you add a second Adar of 30 days. And at the end of second Adar, you begin the new cycle of months, which on the Jewish calendar is observed in the spring. Judaism uniquely, amongst ancient peoples, also found a way to mark the two primary periods when you would have chosen to start the year, either the spring at the beginning of the growing season or the fall at the end. In the spring, we start our annual cycle of months because of the biblical verse that tells us that Passover was celebrated in the first month, the month of Aviv. Now, the first month on the Jewish calendar is no longer called Aviv. Aviv has become the word for spring in modern Hebrew. And so the Jewish calendar adjusts, and where those leap months are put in has a lot to do with what's happening to Passover in relation to the vernal equinox that marks the beginning of spring. If at the start of this year, at Rosh Hashanah, which I'll talk about in a minute, we recognize that Passover would naturally fall before spring begins, it's time to add a leap month to make sure that Passover, the first holiday of the New Year cycle of holidays, does not fall earlier, that the adjustment of the calendar pushes it back later so that it is always on the other side after spring begins. So that's the first main adjustment in the Jewish calendar. But wait, Rabbi, you said the Jewish year starts in the spring with the counting of months. I thought Rosh Hashanah was the Jewish holiday of the new year. Doesn't that fall in the fall? And the answer is yes, it does. But it marks the counting of the year from the other logical place after the fall, late summer harvest, at a time when people were available because the heavy work was done, and had a need to pray to God because they'd want to say thank you for the harvest and start praying for an equally good harvest for next year, and the ability for this harvest to get us through the lull of the growing lax season of winter. So there was a value in marking both places as starts. And if you think about it, it's really no more complicated than looking at the dashboard of your car. These days, I don't think there are any cars out there left that only have one odometer counting the mileage elapsed. Nowadays, we have two. We have the main odometer that counts the elapsed time from the beginning of the car. And we have the resettable and adjustable trip odometer that we can push and reset to 0 and start anytime we want to. Once you push that button on your trip odometer, those 2 meters on your dashboard continue to count the same mileage as it passes, but they're no longer in sync and they give two very different numbers. The Jewish calendar, when it comes to counting the order of the months that make up a year, does the same thing. The cycle of months begins in the spring. The changing of the number in the year comes in the fall. Originally, a close reading of the biblical texts that talk about Jewish time and Jewish holidays makes it appear that the counting of holidays from Passover was a recognition that Passover marked our people's emergence into history as a free people, a free nation. And therefore, it was appropriate to count time internally in a year from Passover. But when it came to counting time for relating to the rest of the world, once we became a monarchy, once we had our own kings, as happened with Saul and then David and Solomon, there was a value in telling time like the rest of the world, which was in the years of the king. And it appears that, for all intents and purposes, the spring calendar was the beginning of Jewish religious time, where the fall calendar, the fall holiday, was the beginning of Jewish political time. And that with the destruction of the first temple and the end of the monarchy, that new year that becomes Rosh Hashanah continued to be the time when we would count years from and start a new year's counting for the sake of counting years, but it would be 6 months off from where we had started counting the months of that lunar cycle of 12 months or 13 months for the sake of consistency with what had come before. It's a little bit complicated. It's actually less complicated to do than to explain. But that's why Jewish holidays seem to move on the secular calendar. That's why they seem to appear to be early some years and late other years. It's interesting. We Jews complain when we feel the holidays are early because we're not prepared. We complain when they come late because we want them to be here already. We never note the years when the holidays come on time, when they fall in the middle of that range of dates that they can. And the truth of the matter is, they come at the same time every year, if you're telling Jewish time and not secular time. Rosh Hashanah is always on the first day of the month of Tishrei, which happens to be the 7th month of the cycle of months. Passover always comes at sundown on the 15th of the month of Nisan, with which we begin the counting of months in the spring. And all the other holidays and observances and fast days and what have you have their fixed times on the calendar. Now, if you read the biblical text really carefully, you will see that in the biblical world, Jewish holidays basically either lasted for a day or 7 days. If you celebrate Jewish time today, it feels like many holidays are, we're told, 8 days. Passover, Sukkot, Hanukkah. Many Jews even celebrate Rosh Hashanah not for a single day, but for 2 days. There's a reason for this historically. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era, and Common Era is how Jews referred to AD, which in Latin is Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, because as Jews, we do not believe that Jesus was our Lord. So we prefer not to use AD as a marker of time. The numbers stay the same, but we call it the Common Era, CE. And BC, before Christ, we call BCE, before the Common Era. So the Romans destroy the Second Temple in 70 CE. And with that, they wipe out the old religious system of sacrifices to worship God. And they expedite a process that was inevitably going to happen over time, in which an alternative view of Judaism, an approach to Judaism, led by a group called the Pharisees, who later called themselves the rabbis, decentralized Judaism from the central shrine in Jerusalem, made it more localized, made it more internalized in terms of replacing physical sacrifices with worship, the prayer of the heart, and also got to rework the calendar somewhat. In the ancient world, where you didn't have calendars, where there was scientific and mathematical knowledge of what's going on in the heavens, but not always enough that you could accurately judge in advance by more than a few months or a year tops what's going to happen down the road in terms of predicting the fall of the calendar. The tradition was that when the new moon was sighted by witnesses, they would come to the Sanhedrin, the rabbinical court, and give testimony that they had seen the new moon. And when the Sanhedrin was convinced that the new moon had in fact been seen and the new month begins, they would send out that word through a system of messengers and later mountaintop flares and fires. But it was still a somewhat time-consuming method to reach the outer precincts of where Jews were living with accurate knowledge of when the new month has started. And so for the rabbis, celebrating on the right day or the right 7 days became really significant. And to make sure that we did, they were willing to fudge. They were willing to add a day, making 1 day celebrations 2 days, 7-day celebrations 8 days. When the celebrations were for good things and they were festivals, who wouldn't want to party for another day? And simply by making that adjustment, they dramatically increased the likelihood that either the first day or the second day would be the right day, if maybe they were off by as much as a day in their announcement or in the word getting there. Or the first 7 days or the second 7 days would be the right 7 days for a 7-day festival. In the Reform movement in modern Israel, we've gone back to the biblical, because in the modern world, we can tell you 1,000 years in advance when Passover is going to fall, on exactly what day of the week. We can calculate that all now. But in the world of 2,000 years ago, with the rabbis, even though they were beginning to understand how to calculate it and wrote treatises in the Talmud and the Mishnah about how to calculate the Jewish calendar, they still required the testimony of witnesses seeing the new moon. There are some fascinating Talmudic stories about disagreements over it. And the Jews were not alone in this. In 1980, in the fall of 1980, I had the occasion to be on a bus tour of Egypt that had started in Jerusalem, where I was studying at the Hebrew University. It was right after the peace accords had been signed. Both countries were very interested in establishing a tourist trade with each other. And so it was a really, really affordable week trip. Drive down on a Sunday, come back the following Sunday. The interesting thing is, as we discovered after we arrived, that in Egypt in 1980, even though everybody knew when the holidays were going to fall, until the government announced that the moon had been seen in its appropriate phase to know when the holiday would be, the holidays could not officially be announced. And so after we arrived, we faced an anomaly where one of the Eids, one of the festival days on the Islamic calendar, had been announced for the following Monday, the day after we were supposed to be back in Jerusalem. With the Islamic Shabbat and Sabbath on Friday, with the Jewish Sabbath on Saturday, and with this Eid, this festival now on Monday, the government had announced not only that the Eid would be observed on Monday as expected, but that the border would be closed on Sunday. And therefore, we would get an extra 2 days on our trip. And being relatively new to the world of public relations and dealing with Western sensibilities, The Egyptian tour company originally thought they were going to get 2 more days payment out of all of us. We very quickly disabused them of that knowledge, and some of us who had need to be back in Jerusalem by Sunday as promised in signing on for the tour actually insisted that it was their responsibility, they should have known and informed us, and therefore it was their responsibility and their cost to get us home whatever it took on Sunday, which is how I found myself flying home with a bunch of Israeli adults from this bus trip and leaving most of my friends behind to enjoy the extra 2 days so that I could get back to Jerusalem and call home for my brother's birthday in the States. Because this was 1980. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have computers and the internet. And indeed, in Egypt, where you still had to see the moon for the calendar to become official, as a tourist, you didn't have access to international phone calls. My parents, who were a little concerned about their child traveling in Egypt, had made very clear that they couldn't stop me, but God help me if I didn't call home for my brother's birthday, which was on that Sunday I was due back, to wish him a happy birthday and tell them I was alive and well and safe. And so, yes, I gave up 2 days of a free extended vacation, not to get disowned from my family. All because of the vagaries of the calendar that still applied, at least in Egypt in 1980. So yes, the new moon had to be witnessed up until a point beyond which we would logically expect that was necessary. And when the rabbis and the great Jewish minds figured out how to calculate the Jewish calendar in advance, they found that the answer was actually from science and math that they had brought back from Babylonia several centuries earlier, and required the day to be divided into 1,080 equal parts. I'll save you doing the math in your head. That doesn't amount to a set number of minutes or seconds or hours in a day. You get fractions no matter what you do, trying to divide 24 hours into 1,080 equal parts. But if you were able to divide the day into 1,080 equal parts, you could, at the beginning of this year, by observing a couple of very quick events in the first several days of this year, know what the reality of next year would be, to know whether things would have to be adjusted. So, for example, when the rabbis added an extra day to celebrations, to make them 2-day celebrations like Rosh Hashanah, they did not do the same thing with Yom Kippur, the fast day of atonement, because fast days for 24 hours are hard enough. For 48 are painful and dangerous, which would be a violation of Jewish ethics and sensibilities. So in addition to not allowing there to be a 2-day fast day, the Jewish calendar also has to work to make sure that we don't effectively create a 2-day fast day. And therefore, Yom Kippur cannot fall on either a Friday immediately before Shabbat or a Sunday immediately after Shabbat, because to have it fall on either Friday or Sunday would effectively make it a 2-day fast, because it would involve Shabbat as well. To celebrate on Friday by fasting all day would mean that you could not cook for Shabbat, and since you cannot cook on Shabbat, according to strict Jewish law, that would create a 2-day fast day. Because you can't cook on Shabbat, you couldn't have the pre-fast meal that would allow you to effectively and safely get through the fast if it fell on Sunday. And so small adjustments are made in the Jewish calendar to make sure that Yom Kippur can never fall on Friday or Sunday. And there are one or two other very small things that really affect only truly observant, Orthodox, ritually observant Jews that affect how the calendar has to play out. And those can all be adjusted at the beginning of the preceding year. And in fact, the adjustment is that the second and third months after Rosh Hashanah can either be 29 or 30 days, depending on what adjustments are needed. So a Jewish year, a standard Jewish year, being a lunar year, is 354 days, plus or minus one for the small adjustments, plus 30 if it's a leap year. And now it sounds really complicated, and I apologize for that, but it really isn't once you start to live it and understand it. So you refer to a year as being normal or deficient or supplemented, and you refer to it as being normal or a leap year. And by those designations, you know exactly how long the Jewish year is. I won't go through all the variations. Your heads will just spin. But trust me that it's fairly easy to address in that way. But again, that's why you get this range of things in terms of where Jewish holidays fall. There's only a roughly 30-day window that they can fall in from their earliest possible point to their latest possible point, because all the adjustments sort of work out and cancel each other out. The ones that are necessary to keep pace with the celestial time, and those that are necessary for the internal needs of the Jewish worshipers who are telling time by this calendar. So you have all of those elements. But if you go back to the elements of natural time, the day, the month, the year, the unit that's missing is the week. And I think one of the great stories of Jewish time is that I think there's a really solid case to be made that Judaism and the Jewish people give the week to the world, because the week represents the 6 days of creation and the Sabbath that followed. And yes, we know, we scientific, rational, modern Jews know, or think we know, that God didn't actually create in 6 days, 24-hour days, and rest on a seventh 24-hour day. But that's how the act of creation is described. And in doing so, it creates a week that then becomes the length of time in the biblical world for the longer festivals of Passover and Sukkot, and in the post-biblical world of Hanukkah, which is actually an 8-day festival, because by then the early thinking was already extending 7-day holidays to 8 to make sure that the right days were being celebrated. So that's all the behind the scenes functioning and logistics and complexity that makes Jewish time appear to be difficult. It really isn't. The Jewish calendar, like every other calendar, has a 7-day week. It runs from Sunday to Saturday. Saturday is the Sabbath. The calendar recreates that Genesis 1 week. Even the latest secular calendar emendation under Pope Gregory in the 16th or 17th century that was church-based. It was Pope Gregory who was adjusting the calendar to account for the fact that a solar year they then had figured out was actually 365 and a quarter days, not 365. And so adding a leap year a day every 4 years for leap year had actually overcompensated over time. Which is why if you look at different accounts of the date of birth of George Washington, for example, we generally, back when we celebrated Washington's birthday as a separate event, celebrated on February 22nd. In fact, George Washington was born when he was born in 1732, the date was February 11th. During the course of his lifetime, those Gregorian adjustments were made and 11 days were added back to the calendar. So the day that he had been born, February 11th, became February 22nd in this new reckoning. Forget how Gregory adjusted things. As a pope, you would have thought that Gregory might have tried to jigger the physical calendar so that the week would run from Monday to Sunday, the Christian Sabbath. But even Pope Gregory couldn't get away with that, which is why I think that the origins of the week as a unit of time are biblical. They're in Genesis, and they're one of the Jewish gifts to Western civilization and culture. So within the Jewish world, you have a weekly holiday, Shabbat. And it is given the status of a weekly holiday. You have a monthly holiday called Rosh Chodesh, the head of the month, the celebration of the new moon each month, which, because of its affinity to the natural rhythm of women's bodies during their mature childbearing years, has over the course of time in Jewish tradition become a women's holiday. And that's celebrated every month. And then you have the annual cycle of fast days and holy days, feasts and festivals that make up the Jewish calendar that we celebrate on the same date on the Jewish calendar every year. And together that becomes the Jewish calendar, that becomes Jewish time. All of it built on these logistics and this balancing of the lunar and the solar. All of it built on the idea that Jewish time goes from darkness toward the light, builds from darkness towards greater light, just as Jewish life builds on growing and advancing. And in the cycle of the year, we go through the cycle of the earth and nature. The Jewish calendar is a very, very green calendar when you take it at its base value. There are the three primary festivals of the year: Passover and Sukkot and Shavuot, that started out as the spring harvest of barley, the early summer harvest of wheat, and the late summer beginning of fall harvest of the full crop, consistent with the growing season in the Middle East, which is a two-season event, not a four-season event. It's a dry growing season, spring and summer. It's a rainy off-season, fall and winter. Those three festivals that were originally harvest festivals also have added to them an overlay of the biblical story, the biblical saga. Passover becomes the celebration of the Exodus from Egypt, the establishment of the free Israelites as a nation amongst the nations of the earth. Shavuot becomes the celebration of receiving the law from God at Sinai. Sukkot, with its booths, becomes the celebration of the 40 years wandering in the desert. And all three of these agricultural festivals now have a significant religious overlay to them. Each of them develops their own traditions for how they're celebrated and what their symbols are. And then there's a series of secondary observances. The later festivals of Hanukkah and Purim, the minor festival of Lag BaOmer, fast days to mark bad days in history and bad times in history. The biblical text mentions as many as 7 holidays. Shabbat is one of them. Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, and at the end of Sukkot, an 8th day festival called Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly, which may have been nothing more than the original way to add an eighth day to make sure that the right 7 days were celebrated. That started early enough that it would get included in the biblical text itself, but seemed to have more significance than just that in connection to making the transition from the growing season to the rainy season. So you start with those five, and then the other two are Yom HaKippurim, and a day on the first day of the seventh month called Yom Zikaron Teruah, the day for remembering the sound of the horn, which to all intents and purposes look like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But even when they're mentioned on the Jewish calendars of the Torah, are left with virtually no details, certainly far less detail than the agriculturally based festivals had. And really, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur become far more significant when the rabbis, after the destruction of the Second Temple, get to recast the Jewish calendar. We happen to live in a time where there's now been a third recasting of the Jewish calendar with the establishment of the modern state of Israel. And there are also modern Israeli holidays that have been added by many, if not all, modern Jews to our annual cycle as well. There are some on the religious extreme who do not recognize the existence of the state of Israel authentically, and therefore do not recognize the holidays they have declared authentically as part of their Jewish calendar. But that's a minor quibble. The interesting thing is there also appear to be some festivals that were declared in connection to Hanukkah by the Hasmonean dynasty, relating to particular days of significance in the battles that led to the establishment of that dynasty. Hanukkah being one of them. In a very roundabout day, the one-day festival of Purim being another. And there are questions as to whether those holidays weren't for a time also of questionable integrity in the eyes of some within the Jewish community. And only over the course of long history and the people's refusal to give them up were they maintained to the point where they then were accepted by the leadership and embraced fully. And I share that just not only because of the fun that we can have in discussing Hanukkah and Purim and some of the quirks about their places on the calendar, but because if it's true that we're in this third period now with the modern state of Israel, we seem to be seeing a history repeating itself. And my suspicion is over the course of time, eventually the objections to these modern Israeli celebrations of Independence Day and Holocaust Remembrance Day and Memorial Day for the fallen in war and in terror, and Yom Yerushalayim, the day for celebrating the reunification of Jerusalem in the 67 war, where those will come to be accepted as fully a part of the Jewish calendar by everyone as well, with the passage of enough time. My suspicion is they will continue to be even more minor holidays than the ones we already have. So that's a big worldview picture of the gestalt, of the philosophy, of the intricacies of Jewish time, Jewish calendar, an introduction to at least the names of some of the Jewish holidays. I'll leave off here in this discussion for now with this recommendation. If you truly want to understand the flow of Jewish time during a year, there's no better way to try to understand it than to try and live by Jewish time. To actually recognize the phenomena in the skies that mark the beginning of a new month, that mark the changing of seasons, the sunrise and the sunset that mark the day. And no better way to learn the holidays than to go out and buy a Jewish pocket calendar or to use a Jewish calendar app on your computer, which will tell you what is done on each Sabbath each week, what Torah is to be read for that week, what Haftarah, what reading from the prophets is to be read, what special elements there are for that particular Shabbat, that will tell you when the different holidays are celebrated and for how long. That way, you get to see it all laid out in front of you. And hopefully this philosophical discussion, this larger global discussion begins to make even more sense as the calendar becomes an object that you can recognize and use, not just words on a piece of paper that make you ask the question of somebody who might know, what's this reference to first candle of Hanukkah or first Seder of Passover? Or what are these words on Saturday on this Jewish calendar that I don't recognize? I'll leave those discoveries for you to make on your own. Until we get together again, whether it's on one of these videos or perhaps in a sharing of questions and responses, formally or informally, as always, I bid you shalom, friends. Until next time. Thanks for watching.